Much discussion about the origins of World War II has been in terms of the three revisionist powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan. Nations who wanted to revise the post-1919 global settlement. Made in Paris. This is all historically valid, since each of the three nations had various grievances that they felt the democracies had not resolved. Any semblance of democracy in Italy had vanished in the 1920s, and it was always shaky in Japan, especially as the power of the army and navy grew greater. In the case of Japan and Italy, a major factor in switching sides from being on the side of Britain and the USA in 1919 to being revisionist by the 1930s was the desire for imperialist expansion. Here one has to admit that the Western democracies were guilty of double standards. Today most people regard colonialism and imperialism as wrong, whatever their politics, and especially the racist ideology upon which it is based. But in the 19th century, in the scramble for Africa, Britain, France and Germany carved up much of that continent. This, added to earlier colonial holdings of the British, Dutch, and French, had created vast empires in Asia. In the 21st century, many would argue that the British conquest of India was no different in kind from the Japanese desire to colonize first Manchuria, a region of China, and then, after 1937, the rest of the country. What is the difference between Britain conquering the lands of present-day Nigeria in the 1890s and Mussolini ordering the invasion of Ethiopia some 4 decades later? Now we would say that all such acts are wrong. But in the 1930s, Churchill was zealously defending British rule in India while at the same time denouncing German imperial aims in Europe. When the Japanese began their campaigns of conquest in 1941, they seized many countries that were Asian nations ruled over by Europeans, an irony lost on many Western countries. But certainly not on the indigenous peoples who had simply swapped one foreign ruler for another. Today we can criticize all such imperialism as morally unacceptable, but in the 1930s it was not quite so simple. The large-scale brutality of Japan showed millions of their fellow Asians that the Japanese were, if anything, far more repressive than the light-touch Europeans. But with Italy we should not forget that Mussolini did not finally side militarily with Hitler until the fall of France. The appeasement of Italy, while morally reprehensible, was a policy that very nearly succeeded. But being nice to Hitler, however plausible his pleas for the reunification of all ethnic Germans into a single country, was another matter altogether. This is why we ought to consider the policy of the democracies towards Germany as being in a different category, since the true nature of the Nazi regime was apparent early on. Mussolini might have been an unpleasant piece of work, but nothing in Italy compared to the concentration camps built from the outset of the Third Reich, or the mass killing of the stormtroopers in 1934, when Hitler and the army colluded to kill the leadership. The latter, under their leader Ernst Röhm, were perceived by Hitler to be a source of rival leadership within the Nazi Party. Even without hindsight, it was surely apparent that Nazi Germany was operating on an altogether different scale of brutality from Italian fascism. However, the democracies had demilitarized on a massive scale back in the 1920s, confident that global and industrial scale war would never return. By the time Hitler was in power in 1933, the world economy had also collapsed, and the prosperity that would have been needed to rebuild vast armies, navies and air forces to deal with the menace now posed was simply no longer there. Pacifism was deeply ingrained in the electorates of the Western democracies, since everyone had a brother or father or friend who had died in World War I. Remember, too, that the political left, while resolutely anti-fascist, was equally opposed to rearmament, and believed strongly instead in the supposed powers of that paper tiger, the League of Nations. The League had been created by Wilsonian idealism. But ironically the USA did not join. It was a great power that had retreated not just from Europe but also from wielding power anywhere in the world. Germany was admitted to the League for good behavior in 1926 but left as soon as Hitler gained power. And the USSR was admitted as late as 1934. It was all very easy to oppose Hitler, and morally the right thing to do, but with no weapons and a League of Nations which had no teeth. Effective opposition to the growing threat of Nazi Germany was therefore, to all intents and purposes, non-existent. In looking at the many reasons for the unexpected fall of France in 1940, we should not forget the complete suspicion of communism among the ruling classes of Western Europe, and almost certainly of the USA as well. The communist attempts at revolution in Germany and Hungary in 1919 had failed, but they had scared Europe's elites witless. Whatever Hitler may or may not be, and the same argument can be applied to Mussolini and later to Franco, he and they were not communists. This considerably distorted the view of Nazi Germany, and made all the difference when the threat posed by Hitler entered a new dimension in 1938, the year that the countdown to war began in earnest.